So I spent more than 150 hours in Crimson Desert, and the game is weird. Visually, it feels like more beautiful The Witcher 3, but the quests don't come anywhere near that quality. The game captures the weight and realism of character movement and animation like Red Dead Redemption 2, but the story isn't even close to that level. The combat is interesting and clearly inspired by Dragon's Dogma, yet the controls feel overcomplicated and clunky. There are some genuinely creative puzzles, almost like the Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, but their ambition gets undermined by unclear game rules. This is not the kind of game that's going to win Game of the Year at major awards, but it might become your personal Game of the Year, and that's exactly why Crimson Desert is a trash-sterpiece. After watching and reading mixed reviews, I still wanted to play the game. So when I first booted up Crimson Desert, I expected to be disappointed. So I sat down. I pressed New Game. I watched the opening cutscene. And within about 20 minutes, I thought, oh, this is something different. The first thing that hits you is detailed character models with impressive motion capture. There are very few games that have achieved what I can only describe as presence, that feeling that the character you're controlling is a real physical entity with weight and momentum. Rockstar did it with Red Dead Redemption 2. Arthur Morgan moved through his world in a way that felt unprecedented, the way his coat swayed, the way he adjusted his hat in the rain. Cliff does something similar. Not identical. The context is completely different, the tone is different, the animation philosophy is different, but there's something in the way he transitions between movements, the way he reacts to terrain, the way his body language tells you things about the moment he's in that reminded me of that RDR2 feeling in a way I wasn't prepared for. When Cliff walks through a crowded marketplace, he navigates it like a person. When he's climbing a rocky hillside, you can feel the effort. This, I thought, is the game's first lie. Because that level of craft in the character and the animation creates a promise. It whispers to you, this is a game that pays attention to everything. This is a game where every detail matters. This is a game with something real to say. And Crimson Desert desperately wants you to believe that. It absolutely has the visual vocabulary of a profound experience. Every frame looks like a painting. This is the first and most fundamental contradiction at the heart of Crimson Desert. The game looks and feels like something with profound things to say, and then it opens its mouth, and what comes out is fine, serviceable, occasionally compelling in a broad action movie kind of way, but nowhere near what the aesthetic is promising. I think about The Witcher 3 constantly when I play Crimson Desert. Not just visually, but in terms of what that game did with its quests. The Bloody Baron quest line, A Poet Under Pressure, series story. The way even minor side quests in that game had moral complexity, had characters you cared about, had endings that stayed with you for days. The Witcher 3 understood that quests are not just content delivery systems, they're stories. They're the primary way the game communicates its themes and its humanity. Crimson Desert's quests are not bad. I want to be fair about this. There are individual quests in this game that are genuinely excellent. Small human stories tucked away in corners of the map that caught me completely off guard. A merchant who's been writing letters to a dead wife for 10 years. A village where everyone is pretending a tragedy never happened, and you slowly unravel why. A quest involving a broken clock tower that is, mechanically, almost entirely boring, but emotionally sucker-punched me in the last 5 minutes in a way I didn't see coming. But these moments are islands. They're surrounded by an ocean of quests that feel functional rather than meaningful. Go here, kill this, collect that, return. Cliff as a protagonist is present and capable, but he doesn't have the moral complexity or the writerly depth of Arthur Morgan or Geralt. He reacts to the world more than he reflects on it. And the main storyline, for all its cinematic ambition, follows patterns so familiar that I could predict most of its beats from the first act. This is not a deal breaker. I want to be clear about that. Not every game needs to be a narrative masterpiece. But when your world is this beautiful, when your character animation is this expressive, when your environmental storytelling is this sophisticated, you're making a promise, and the main story doesn't keep it. Let me talk about fighting, because here's the thing about Crimson Desert's combat. It is, at its core, genuinely brilliant. It is also, for a significant portion of the game, an absolute nightmare to interact with. The comparison that kept coming to mind was Dragon's Dogma. Not Dragon's Dogma 2, though that's relevant too. I mean the original Dragon's Dogma, that strange cult classic from Capcom that nobody played when it came out, and then everyone discovered 5 years later and declared a hidden masterpiece. That game had a combat system that was simultaneously deeply satisfying and kind of incomprehensibly obtuse, and it asked you to simply endure the confusion until you emerged on the other side understanding it. Crimson Desert does the same thing, but more aggressively. The foundation is this: Cliff's combat style is defined by what weapons you choose, not by a class system. You're not a warrior or a mage or a rogue. You're Cliff, and Cliff can fight with whatever he finds, and the way he fights changes fundamentally depending on what's in his hands. Pick up a two-handed greatsword and he becomes slow and devastating, all momentum and impact. Switch to dual short blades and the whole rhythm changes, faster, more evasive, more combo-focused. Mix in a ranged weapon and suddenly you're managing distances and positioning in a completely different way. This is good. This is genuinely, fundamentally good game design. The weapon-defined playstyle creates natural builds without ever forcing you into a box, and it means that finding a new weapon isn't just a stat check, it's a potential identity shift. And then there's the learning system. Cliff learns combat techniques by observing enemies, not just in a vague progression sense. Literally, in the middle of a fight, if an enemy uses a move you haven't seen before, you can trigger a focus mechanic that has Cliff study the motion. And if you successfully identify and survive the technique, you can add a version of it to your own repertoire. This is one of the most elegant design ideas I've encountered in action combat in years. It makes enemies interesting beyond their threat level. It reframes combat encounters as both dangers and opportunities. It's the kind of system that, when you understand it, changes the whole texture of the game. But here's where the nightmare begins. The game doesn't adequately explain this system. It doesn't adequately explain a lot of its systems. There are mechanics layered on top of mechanics on top of mechanics, and the tutorial drip feeds you information at a pace that feels almost deliberately obfuscatory. I have 150 hours in this game, and I'm still occasionally discovering interactions between systems that I didn't know existed. Some players will tell you this is a feature. That discovery is the point, that the joy is in gradually understanding a deep system rather than having it handed to you. And I understand that argument. I've made it myself about other games. But there's a difference between depth that rewards patience and a control scheme that is, in certain specific ways, just badly designed. Crimson Desert has both, and it's important to separate them, because conflating them leads either to unfair dismissal or to defending things that genuinely shouldn't be defended. The lock-on system in its base form is unreliable in ways that feel like bugs rather than features. The dodge roll, one of the most fundamental mechanics in any action game, has a contextual sensitivity that means it occasionally does something different from what you intended, and in a game with enemies that can kill you in 3 hits, occasionally is not acceptable. The camera in enclosed spaces makes fights actively unreadable for the first 20 hours until you've learned to manually compensate for it in ways the game never explicitly teaches you. These are not charming rough edges. These are legitimate problems that made me die in ways that felt unfair, that made me retry sections not because I'd failed to understand the challenge, but because the tool I was using to face the challenge was imprecise in frustrating ways. And yet I kept fighting. I kept pushing through, because on the other side of the frustration, once the systems clicked, once I had enough vocabulary to actually express myself in combat, it became something genuinely special. A big boss fight in Crimson Desert at hour 80 with a deep weapon kit and a solid understanding of the learning mechanic and finally, a grip on the dodge timing. That is one of the best feeling action combat experiences I've had in recent memory. The inputs and the outputs matched in a way that felt earned rather than given. Dragon's Dogma made me work for its rewards too. It made me feel stupid before it made me feel powerful. Crimson Desert is the same. The question is whether you're willing to pay the price. I need to talk about the puzzles. I need to talk about them specifically because they are, I think, the most concentrated expression of everything Crimson Desert is. Its grandeur and its failure. Living in the same room at the same time, looking at each other with mutual incomprehension. Tears of the Kingdom was the recent benchmark for open-world puzzle design. What Nintendo did with the shrines and the depths and the sky islands was create a sandbox of physics and mechanics that was consistently legible. You always understood what tools you had. You always understood roughly what the puzzle was asking, and the creativity came in figuring out how to apply known tools to new problems. The game trusted you to be inventive, but gave you the vocabulary to be inventive with. Crimson Desert's puzzles have the visual ambition of Tears of the Kingdom. They have, in some cases, the mechanical ambition too. I've encountered puzzle spaces in this game that are so architecturally stunning, so obviously designed with love and vision, that I've stopped and taken screenshots just to document the fact that someone built this thing and put it in a video game. But legibility, consistent rule communication, a clear sense of what your tools are and what the problem is asking. This is where Crimson Desert stumbles in a way that breaks my heart a little because the potential is so visible. The core issue is that the game has too many interacting systems, and it doesn't always telegraph which systems are relevant in any given puzzle space. Is this a physics puzzle? A combat mechanic puzzle? Does it require a specific item I might not have? Does it require an ability from the skill tree I might not have invested in? Is there a timing component? Is there an environmental manipulation component? Crimson Desert doesn't always tell you. It drops you into a beautiful room and trusts you to figure out what kind of puzzle you're even solving before you can begin to solve it. Sometimes this works magnificently. Some of my favorite moments in 150 hours have been the slow dawning realizations. The moment where the room suddenly makes sense, where the mechanism you'd been ignoring snaps into context, and the solution reveals itself with an elegance that feels almost musical. Those moments are incredible. They're the moments that remind you why puzzle design exists as an art form. But for every one of those transcendent moments, there were 3 where I spent 20 minutes chasing the wrong theory, or worse, where I finally resorted to looking up a solution and discovered that the answer was obvious to someone who had fully absorbed a tutorial segment I'd breezed past at hour 4. The deeper problem is that Crimson Desert doesn't have a consistent grammar for its puzzles. Each one feels like it was designed in relative isolation, applying its own logic, its own rule set, its own visual language. There's no accumulated intuition the game is building. Every new puzzle space is a fresh negotiation with potentially unfamiliar systems. That would be fine, even exciting, if the game was better at communicating the rules of each new space as you entered it. But it's not. It assumes you've absorbed everything. It assumes you were paying attention. It assumes a level of encyclopedic retention that most human beings don't bring to video games. This is the most direct parallel to Tears of the Kingdom's philosophy, and the most direct divergence from it. Nintendo built a game where the vocabulary was simple enough to be truly internalized. Pearl Abyss built a game where the vocabulary is vast and extraordinary, and sometimes overwhelming. Both approaches have merit, but only one of them makes you feel like a genius when you solve something. The other makes you feel, occasionally, like the game is withholding information as a design choice rather than as a challenge. I don't think it's malicious. I think it's a consequence of Crimson Crimson Desert's central disposition, which is, we made everything we could think of and we trust you to explore it. That generosity of content is also sometimes a generosity of confusion. Here's what nobody tells you about Crimson Desert before you play it. The stuff between the main quests is where the game actually lives. I have, in 150 hours, done the following things in Crimson Desert. I managed a trading post for about 6 real-world hours and became genuinely invested in its economic margins. I spent an entire afternoon following a rumor about a cursed fishing spot that turned into a 3-quest chain involving a sea monster, an ancient maritime cult, and a recipe for a soup that supposedly granted visions. I found a traveling wrestling competition and entered it, lost, trained, re-entered it over the course of 2 in-game weeks, and finally won a championship belt that does absolutely nothing gameplay-wise, but sits in my inventory as a monument to genuinely wasted time that I do not regret at all. I got into a card game with an NPC who turned out to be significantly better at the card game than I was, and I played against that NPC 7 times over the course of the game because I kept running into them in different towns and I needed to beat them. I eventually did, on my 8th attempt. In a small village in the southeast of the map, in a tavern during a rainstorm with no one watching. And it felt, I'm not exaggerating, it felt like an accomplishment. This is Crimson Desert at its best. Not the main story, not the cinematic boss fights, as spectacular as those are. The best of Crimson Desert is the texture of the world, the density of the stuff it puts in your path, the specificity of the lives it imagines for the people of Pywell, the way it trusts you to find your own story within the scaffolding of the one it's trying to tell. There's a mechanic where Cliff can invest money in local businesses and return later to find them changed, expanded, struggling, relocated, or, in one memorable case, completely transformed into something unrecognizable because of a sequence of events triggered by a different quest I'd completed 3 hours earlier. I didn't plan that. The game didn't announce it. I just came back to a shop I'd invested in and it was different, and for 5 minutes I stood there trying to work out what had happened and feeling like the world had been quietly running without me. That's the magic. That's the thing Crimson Desert does that very few games do. It makes you feel like a participant in a world rather than a player moving through a level. The simulation underneath the surface is deep enough that it generates its own surprises, its own serendipity, its own small human moments that no one scripted but that feel like they emerged organically from the logic of the world. Red Dead Redemption 2 had this quality in spades. Its world was so detailed, so alive with behavioral simulation, that it could generate unexpected moments that felt more real than scripted content. Crimson Desert reaches for this and sometimes achieves it. The difference is that RDR2 maintained this quality consistently. The density of the world was uniform. The behavior systems were reliable. The NPC interaction was layered and contextual throughout. Crimson Desert is more uneven. Some areas of the map feel lushly populated with this kind of emergent depth. Others feel emptier, more template-like, as though the design team's attention had been unevenly distributed. You'll go from a section that feels miraculous to a section that feels like filler, sometimes within the span of an hour. But when it's good, when it's really good, I have not experienced a world like this in a long time. Maybe not since Elden Ring. And that's a different kind of world, a lonelier world, a world that achieves its density through absence rather than presence. Crimson Desert's version of a living world is almost the opposite, maximalist, crowded, operatic in its abundance. I want to make an argument that I think gets dismissed too quickly in game criticism. Not every great experience is a great product. We've developed, in the discourse around games, a tendency to conflate these two things, to assume that if a game is a profound experience, it must therefore be a well-made product, and conversely, that if a game has significant mechanical or structural flaws, it cannot be a truly great experience. This binary is wrong. It's always been wrong. And Crimson Desert is one of the clearest demonstrations of its wrongness that I've encountered. Crimson Desert is, in measurable, reviewable, objective criteria terms, a flawed game. The story underperforms relative to its visual ambition. The combat has a learning curve that crosses into genuine unfriendliness. The puzzle design is inconsistent in ways that are legitimately frustrating. The UI is a labyrinth. The onboarding is poor. Technical performance has improved since launch but was rough on day one. These are real criticisms. They're all true. And if you evaluate the game against a rubric of craft and polish and deliberate design excellence, Crimson Desert scores lower than it probably should, given the evident resources and talent that went into building it. But here's the thing. Here's what I keep coming back to after 150 hours. I have had more genuine, unscripted, personally meaningful moments in Crimson Desert than in most games I've played in the last 3 years. Moments that weren't on any review checklist, that weren't telegraphed by any achievement notification, that emerged from the specific intersection of what the game had built and what I brought to it. Moments that felt like mine. That's rare. That's genuinely, non-trivially rare. Most games, even great games, even games with higher review scores than Crimson Desert, don't give you that. They give you experiences that were designed and that you execute. They give you authored moments that you witness. They give you systems that are deep and satisfying, but that operate within parameters that never quite surprise you. Crimson Desert, at its best, genuinely surprises you. And I think that capacity for surprise, that sense that the world is large enough and dense enough that you might find something no one has found in the same way before, is worth something that doesn't always show up in review scores. I keep thinking about what my favorite games actually gave me at their best. Not the mechanical excellence, not the narrative craft, but the feeling of being inside something that cared about its own existence enough to build more than you would ever see. Crimson Desert has that feeling. It's buried under frustrations, sometimes buried deep, but it's there. I've been trying to find the right word for Crimson Desert for about 100 hours. I've run through the usual vocabulary: flawed masterpiece, ambitious failure, diamond in the rough, and none of them quite fit because they all imply a directionality that isn't accurate. Flawed masterpiece implies the masterpiece is the real thing, and the flaws are unfortunate blemishes. Ambitious failure implies the failure is ultimately dominant and the ambition was wasted. Diamond in the rough implies there's a perfect game hiding inside the imperfect one, waiting to be polished out. None of these are true of Crimson Desert. The flaws and the brilliance are not separable. They come from the same source. They are the same impulse expressed in different registers. Pearl Abyss built a game that tried to contain everything. Every idea, every system, every mechanic, every aesthetic inspiration, every possible activity. They looked at the entire landscape of modern action RPG design and they said, "We want all of it." And they built it. They actually built it. The world exists. It runs. It's populated. It functions. The ambition was not defeated by reality. Reality accommodated the ambition, at least enough to ship. And because of that totality, because of the sheer excess of it, the seams show. Of course they do. You cannot build a cathedral in 4 years and expect every stone to be perfectly placed. You cannot design 50 interlocking systems and expect all of them to be elegantly communicated. You cannot create a world this large and populate every corner of it with the same density and care. But you also cannot, when building something this large, not occasionally stumble into accidental greatness. You cannot populate a world with this many systems and not occasionally produce emergent magic that no one planned. You cannot write this many quests and not occasionally produce something that cuts you right to the quick. You cannot design this many combat encounters and not occasionally engineer a moment so perfectly calibrated to your specific playstyle that it feels like it was made just for you. This is the TRASH-Sterpiece. Not a masterpiece with trash in it, and not trash with occasional masterful moments. It's something more integrated and more interesting than either of those. A game where the excess that creates the problems is the same excess that creates the wonder. Where the ambition is simultaneously the source of the flaws and the source of the brilliance. Will Crimson Desert win Game of the Year? Almost certainly not. The games that win those awards are the polished ones, the coherent ones, the games where every element has been filed smooth and every experience has been considered from every angle and the seams have been made invisible. Those are genuinely great games. I'm not dismissing that kind of achievement. But those games, the polished ones, the GOTY contenders, they rarely do what Crimson Desert does at its best. They rarely surprise you. They rarely give you a moment that's actually yours. They rarely make you feel like you're inside something too large to fully understand, too strange to fully map, too alive to fully predict. Crimson Desert is the game I'm going to be talking about in 5 years. Not because it's the best game of its year, but because it's the game that gave me the most stories. The game that generated the most friction and, from that friction, the most heat. The game that made me angrier than any game I've played recently and also made me feel things I hadn't felt while playing games in years. I'm at 150 hours. I'm not done. There are sections of the map I haven't fully explored. There are quest lines I started and didn't finish. There's a card game rematch I still haven't secured. There's a puzzle in a cave in the Eastern Badlands that I've returned to 4 times, that I still haven't solved, that I keep thinking about when I'm not playing. I still think the combat controls are too clunky in their base form. I still think the main story doesn't earn its cinematic ambitions. I still think the puzzle design is inconsistently communicated, in ways that shouldn't be defended. I still think the onboarding is genuinely bad, and probably cost the game a significant portion of its potential audience. All of that is true. All of that still stands. And Cliff still moves through his world with a weight and a presence that stops me in my tracks sometimes. Even now, 150 hours in. The world still surprises me. The world is still, somehow, not fully known to me, despite the time I've put in. That's the dual nature of this thing. It's a frustrating game and a magnificent game. It's a game that doesn't respect your time and a game that rewards your time in ways that are genuinely hard to articulate. It's a game that makes you feel stupid and a game that makes you feel like an explorer in the oldest sense of the word. It's a TRASH-Sterpiece, and it might be my or your personal game of the year. Not because it's the best game released this year, it probably isn't. Because its roughness made me work, and the work made the discoveries feel real. Because every hour I spent confused or frustrated was an hour I spent genuinely inside something, rather than watching something happen on a screen. Because when I finally figure out that puzzle in the Eastern Badlands, and I will, it's going to mean something. And that's worth more than perfect.